Mark 15, reading from verse 22. And they brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. They offered him wine drugged with myrrh, but he refused it. Then the soldiers nailed him to the cross. They divided his clothes and threw dice to decide who would get each piece. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. A sign announced the charge against him. It read, "The King of the Jews." At noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. Then, at 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Now let's see how John may have been feeling at the foot of the cross.
He was groaning, a sound like I'd never heard before, a sound I never want to hear again. Awful. Stomach churning, indescribable, the sound of unimaginable pain, of overwhelming sorrow, of utter isolation, and I could watch it no longer. I thought I was ready for it, prepared for the worst, for I knew he had to die. But I wasn't ready not for this. I never realized people could suffer so much, that anything could be quite so terrible. But I know now, and I'm telling you straight, I'd have felt sorry for anyone facing that. A robber, a mugger, even a murderer. My heart would still have bled for them. But to see Jesus there, that man of such gentleness and compassion, a man who had always loved and never hated, a man who had brought healing to the sick and wholeness to the broken, it all but finished me. What had he done to deserve this? I prayed that God would finish it, put him out of his misery. But still the torment continued. Still they mocked him, delighting in his pain. I knew he was suffering. But even then, I didn't realize how much. Not until he lifted his head and I saw the despair in his eyes. Not until he spoke and I heard the wretchedness in his voice. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Then I realized, and my blood ran cold. He felt alone, totally alone, abandoned by everyone he'd loved and trusted, even by God himself. He could cope with the rest. He'd even expected it, but God? It was the final torture, the ultimate agony, a pain beyond words. He was groaning, a sound like I'd never heard before, a sound which suddenly I understood, and a sound I could listen to no longer.
Standing near the cross were Jesus' mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother standing there beside the disciple he loved, he said to her, "Dear woman, here is your son." And he said to this disciple, "Here is your mother." And from then on, this disciple took her into his home.
He was thinking of me even then. I couldn't believe it, despite everything he was going through. The awful, stomach-churning agony which seemed to pierce my very soul. He was concerned more about my welfare than his. Yet I shouldn't have been surprised. It was so like Jesus, the way he'd been from a boy, always putting others before himself. I dared to hope that just this once it would be different, that for the first time in his life, he'd look after number one. Why not? Would it have been so wrong? He'd given enough already, hadn't he? Scarcely a moment to himself. The crowds always with him, clamouring, calling, pleading, demanding, enough to break any lesser man. And as if that wasn't enough, his enemies had been there stalking him, unable to conceal their hatred, watching his every move, waiting for their moment. He knew what they were up to, yet he continued without a murmur of complaint, always having time, always ready to respond, nothing and no one outside of his concern. I saw him so many times just about all in, drained to the point of exhaustion. I can't tell you how much it troubled me to see my wonderful boy pouring himself out in a constant act of sacrifice, pushing himself to the very limit. But it was useless to argue. I tried it sometimes, and he simply smiled at me in that gentle way of his, knowing I understood full well there was no other way. He was right, I knew that, and I knew equally there was no way he'd come down from that cross. But I could still hope, couldn't I? Still pray I might be wrong. He was thinking of others even then. Not only me, but a common thief hanging there beside him. My fellow women, sobbing their hearts out. Even those who'd hounded him to his death. Thinking, in fact, of everyone except himself.